In 2022, a belated miracle tore through the thick dust of 50 years of despair. A 6-year-old boy, who vanished without a trace in Florida in 1972, was found, alive, grown up, and completely unaware that he had once been the haunting name in a forgotten cold case. In an instant, the truth hit like a punch, straight to memory. His biological family had searched for him in silence for half a century, while his life had been built on an identity that wasn't his own. Today, I'm taking you straight into the heart of a tragedy that spanned generations. What really happened on that fateful afternoon in 1972, why the investigation collapsed, and how a child could disappear from his old world and grow up normally somewhere else. This isn't just a missing person case, it's a story of stolen identity, justice that arrived too late, and a truth that patiently waited 50 years to be called by its rightful name. You are my most valuable companions on this journey. Take a deep breath, because right now, we're stepping into a story powerful enough to leave you breathless, haunted, and unable to look away. Before we dive deep into this shocking real-life case, let me know where you're watching from, and if you love these journeys uncovering justice buried by time, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Florida in 1972 was a typical slice of post-war America, where working-class neighborhoods were scattered amid the heat, palm trees, and low concrete roads. Life moved slowly in an almost taken-for-granted sense of safety, when kids could play outside from morning till evening without constant supervision. Doors were often left ajar, and neighbors knew each other well enough to believe that danger, if it existed, would be easy to spot from afar. In a neighborhood like that in Miami, the Rodriguez family had lived for years in a small, simple but tidy house where daily routines rarely changed. Adults went to work, kids went to school, and then played out front. Everything ran on habit to the point that no one imagined an ordinary afternoon could become the dividing line between before and after for an entire lifetime. The Rodriguez family was a typical working-class household, not wealthy but stable, with close and familiar relationships inside the home. William Rodriguez, 6 years old, was the youngest child, slender build, tan skin from playing outdoors all the time. Dark hair always slightly tousled after running around, gentle and curious personality, familiar with every little corner of the neighborhood, and usually staying within the range adults considered safe. William was especially close to his family members, particularly the one who spent the most time with him in daily life, the very person who was the last witness to see him before he disappeared. That bond was not just responsibility, but absolute trust, because in the family's mind, William was within sight of someone familiar, someone not a stranger, someone they had never had reason to suspect. That morning passed like any other, familiar activities unfolding in their usual rhythm. No warning signs, no conflicts, nothing unusual enough to make the adults change their habits or heighten their vigilance, until an anomaly appeared, not as a clear threat, but only as a situation slightly off the familiar track, a presence that didn't fully belong to the everyday scene, yet not dangerous enough to trigger an immediate defensive response. The adult's initial reaction was trust mixed with hesitation, quickly pushed aside by the thought that everything was still under control, that there was no reason to make a big deal out of a small moment on a peaceful afternoon. It was in that brief window, while familiar assumptions remained intact, that William left the spot where everyone believed he was. The time he went missing didn't match his usual daily habits, nor did it fit the family's familiar logic, but at that moment, the discrepancy wasn't clear enough to be recognized as a danger signal. William's actions in those decisive minutes stayed within the range he had been allowed, while the witness's actions, though without malice, were limited by subjectivity and the belief that the boy had only temporarily slipped out of sight, rather than left the safe space. When the family realized William was no longer where he was supposed to be, the first response was spontaneous searching, calling his name throughout the neighborhood, checking familiar spots, asking neighbors in a state of panic, mixed with hope that this was just a misunderstanding, that he would reappear in a few minutes, like he had many times before. Initial witnesses provided scattered and vague information, each remembering a different detail, no one certain about the timing or direction of movement, making the overall picture fragmented and hard to piece together from the very first hours. As time passed without William returning, fear gradually replaced hope. Searching the neighborhood yielded no results. The family had to accept that this disappearance was no longer something they could resolve on their own, and in a state of panic, mixed with helplessness, they contacted the police, officially reporting that William Rodriguez, 6 years old, had gone missing, closing a day that began with familiar calm and opening a void that no one in the family could have imagined would last for decades. The Rodriguez family's missing person call was received in a context where local police still viewed most child disappearances as temporary incidents rather than serious crimes, and from the moment the file was opened, William Rodriguez's case was processed according to the standard procedures of 1972, a process that emphasized initial response, speed, but relied heavily on experience-based assumptions rather than scientific evidence. The first information recorded centered on the last confirmed sighting of William, the identity of the last witness, the boy's usual activity range, and basic identifying features, all hastily compiled in the early hours, while the family was still in shock, and statements hadn't yet been cross-verified, creating an initial file that was more skeletal than complete. From that early data, the initial investigative assumption quickly formed, focusing on the possibility that William had wandered off in the neighborhood, or met with an unintentional accident within his familiar range, since there were no signs of forced entry, no reports of violence, no ransom demand, and no direct witness confirming an abduction. Factors typically considered necessary to escalate the case into a serious criminal investigation. This assumption wasn't an official conclusion, but it was strong enough to shape how police allocated resources and directed next steps in the early days, anchoring the investigation focus tightly to the immediate area where William disappeared, rather than expanding early to other possibilities. An investigator was assigned to handle the file, coordinating with local patrol units to deploy searches, the initial perimeter drawn based on the distance a 6-year-old could travel in a short time. Surrounding roads were swept, familiar spots checked, and the community notified for support, but all these actions took place within the framework of the assumption that William was still nearby, that the case could be resolved by gradually widening the search circle rather than changing the fundamental approach. The assignment of investigation and establishment of search perimeters in this phase were more decisive than they appeared, because once the initial assumption was accepted as the foundation, all subsequently collected information tended to be interpreted to reinforce that assumption rather than challenge it. Mismatched details were easily dismissed as noise or errors due to unreliable witness memory, while elements that fit the prevailing thinking were prioritized and pursued. Early strategic decisions, though made under conditions of limited information and time pressure, inadvertently locked the case into a specific investigative trajectory, where abduction wasn't entirely ruled out, but was relegated to secondary status, only considered if other leads failed, and that very delay directly affected how the file was built, how witnesses were interviewed, and how resources were used in the days that followed. While the Rodriguez family expected a more aggressive response, what they witnessed was an administrative process that took time, with forms to complete, reports to verify, and steps to follow established protocol, causing their sense of urgency to not fully align with the actual pace of the investigation. Police, from their perspective, didn't see this as indifference, but as caution, because jumping to conclusions too soon about the nature of the case could lead to hard-to-correct mistakes. However, that caution, combined with the era's systemic assumptions, created a growing gap between what the family felt and what the investigation was actually pursuing. As the initial investigative steps were carried out, no clear signs emerged, forcing police to change strategy, and each passing hour without new leads, further reinforced the belief that William was still somewhere near the neighborhood, waiting to be found, a belief reasonable enough to maintain the current direction, but dangerous enough to obscure other possibilities, laying the groundwork for a chain of decisions whose impact would extend far beyond the first few days, and throughout the entire subsequent handling of the case. From the assumptions formed during the investigation activation phase, police returned to the area where William was believed to have disappeared, with the goal of reinforcing the view that the boy remained within his familiar activity range, and that very approach dominated the entire initial examination, with focus placed on the nearest spaces, the paths a 6-year-old could access on his own, the areas that, based on investigators' experience, were often the endpoints of wandering cases. The neighborhood was swept section by section, roads marked, blind spots noted, but the examination uncovered no clear physical traces like clothing, personal items, or signs of struggle, making the scene disturbingly clean, not enough to confirm an accident, but also not enough to establish criminal activity. Alongside checking spaces, investigators began collecting timeline data from those identified as having seen William that day, a process that quickly revealed a core difficulty. Witness memory doesn't operate like a clock, and when asked to pinpoint times, each person gave different figures, sometimes differing by only minutes, but in a missing child case, those minutes were critical. The last witness claimed the sighting was around midday. A neighbor recalled the boy still being near the house in early afternoon, while another statement suggested William had left the area earlier. These pieces of information were initially recorded as normal variations in human memory, not yet enough to shake the overall assumption. Based on those statements, an initial timeline was constructed, starting from the last confirmed sighting of William, to the moment the family realized he was no longer where he should be. The interval between these points was treated as the disappearance window, and all investigative efforts focused on narrowing that window, determining what William did during that time, and where he might have gone. This timeline, though carefully built from available data, relied too heavily on assumed consistency in statements, while the nature of the accounts was inherently mismatched. As investigators cross-referenced details further, time gaps began to emerge, not as completely empty slots, but as inexplicable overlaps, where one witness claimed William was still present while another was certain he had already left the area. These contradictions forced the team to question the accuracy of the initial timeline, but rather than seeing it as a sign that the foundational assumption might be wrong, they temporarily explained it as witness confusion or misremembered event order. The most notable gap appeared when no one could confirm William's location during a short but pivotal period, a period long enough for him to leave the neighborhood if assisted from outside, yet short enough to be easily overlooked in scattered accounts. This was the moment the timeline became most fragile, because shifting just one small marker would change William's entire presumed movement path. Faced with these inconsistencies, the investigative team had to adjust part of the initial assumption, not by changing the nature of the case, but by slightly expanding the time window and possible range, allowing for the chance William had left the area earlier than first thought. Though this possibility was still not treated as central, this adjustment was more technical than strategic, aimed at explaining data contradictions rather than re-questioning the overall investigative direction. However, the very need to adjust the timeline, even minimally, inadvertently revealed that the case's data foundation was not as solid as imagined, that what had been considered certain in the early hours was actually the result of piecing together imperfect memory fragments, and that any decisions based on that timeline carried the risk of reinforcing a wrong assumption. Nevertheless, in the context of lacking physical evidence and pressure to act quickly, the team continued using the adjusted timeline as the primary tool to guide next steps, believing that through gradual refinement, they would get closer to the truth, without realizing that each small adjustment also meant discarding possibilities outside the accepted time frame. making the case's true gap not only where William went, but whether the timeline they relied on actually reflected reality. From the timeline that had been constructed but remained fragile, the focus of the investigation shifted entirely to the witnesses, with the expectation that by clarifying who had seen William, where, and at what time, the existing gaps would be filled. However, this process quickly revealed the inherent complexity of human memory when placed under the pressure of time and fear. The primary witness, the last person confirmed to have been near William before he disappeared, was questioned multiple times, with questions revolving around the sequence of events, specific time periods, and seemingly minor details. Each retelling carried the same core but differed in secondary points, differences not large enough to be considered lies, but sufficient to raise doubts about the absolute accuracy of the statement. Meanwhile, the sense of responsibility and psychological pressure led this witness to reinterpret memories in a way that aligned with what they believed was reasonable, inadvertently blurring the original off-standard details. Alongside the primary witness's statement, investigators expanded their collection of information from children in the neighborhood who had played with or seen William that day. But extracting accounts from 6 to 10-year-old children posed a major challenge, as their memories were often tied more to images and emotions than to chronological sequence, leading to vivid but hard-to-pinpoint descriptions. Some remembered William appearing at a specific location, others recalled him leaving with someone, or in a different direction. These details were initially recorded but quickly labeled unreliable due to the age and limited expressive ability of the tellers. Statements from neighbors and passers-by, though formally considered more reliable, also failed to provide the necessary consistency, as each person had only seen William for a brief moment, from a different angle, and often only recalled the event after learning the boy was missing, causing memories to be influenced by subsequent information and personal assumptions. When asked about timing, many had to estimate based on their daily routines rather than a clock, creating a series of overlapping and hard-to-reconcile time markers. When investigators placed the statements side by side, contradictions emerged not in the main content, but in the secondary details. Details that played a key role in determining William's direction. Some statements asserted he was still near home at a time when another was certain he had left the area, and no physical evidence was strong enough to prioritize one account over the other. Assessing witness reliability in that context forced police to rely on subjective criteria of the era, such as age, relationship to the family, expressive ability, and consistency across multiple interrogations. These criteria helped filter information, but also carried hidden biases, causing some statements, especially from children or those unable to pinpoint time exactly, to be dismissed early from serious consideration. In that filtering process, certain important information was sidelined, not because it was clearly wrong, but because it did not fit the investigative assumption being maintained. Details suggesting William might have left the area in an unnatural way, or that an external factor unrelated to daily routine was present, were deemed too vague to pursue given limited resources. The dismissal of this information did not occur as a single decision, but as the result of many small steps, as each investigator, based on personal experience, chose to focus on clean statements that easily fit into the timeline, inadvertently letting the puzzling pieces fall outside the overall picture. The contradictions between statements, rather than being seen as a sign that the foundational assumption might need re-examination, were explained as the natural consequence of a disturbing case, and thus not strong enough to alter the overall strategy. This led to an accepted version of events gradually forming in the file, one that did not fully reflect the diversity of the initial accounts, but only retained what fit the established timeline. In that context, witnesses who felt their statements were not heard, or were misunderstood, gradually withdrew, no longer providing additional information, while investigators, believing they had gathered enough data to proceed, moved to the next steps without realizing that the very inconsistency among statements, if explored more deeply, might have opened different paths. As a result, when most witnesses had been questioned, and the witness file was completed, the case did not move closer to the truth, but only became clearer about one thing. There was no unified story about William's final moments scene, and that lack of unity, rather than prompting a re-evaluation, was framed as an unavoidable obstacle, causing key information to be removed from the investigative orbit at the stage where it could have made the biggest difference. From the fact that many important statements had been discarded or flattened during the witness filtering process, the investigation gradually shifted its focus to systematizing the official hypotheses, seeing it as the only way to create logical order for an increasingly tangled case. And it was at this stage that the evaluation and prioritization of hypotheses began to clearly reveal structural biases. The lost hypothesis was placed at the top almost reflexively, as it fit William's age, the context of a neighborhood considered safe, and the reality that there were no clear signs of violent intervention. In that frame of thinking, William's familiarity with the area, and frequent playing alone within a certain range, were not seen as protective factors, but instead became reasons reinforcing the idea that he might have gone farther than usual without realizing it, leading to inability to return. When this hypothesis was applied, many details began to be interpreted in ways that supported it. Time gaps in the timeline were seen as periods of William's free movement. Contradictory statements were explained by the possibility he changed direction, and the complete absence of physical traces was rationalized by him, possibly falling into a situation where evidence was not easily detectable. However, the deeper the analysis, the more the lost hypothesis revealed weaknesses hard to ignore. As in similar cases, children usually left some sign, whether personal items, movement traces, or at least a reliable report of being seen in distress, while here William's disappearance was so thorough it did not fit the usual lost pattern nonetheless. These inconsistencies were not enough to discard the hypothesis, but only kept it as a possibility, not yet provable, but also not refutable. The accident hypothesis was placed alongside as a supplementary option, focusing on environmental factors that could endanger a child, especially in Florida with its canals, ponds, and uncontrolled vacant lots. In this thinking, the failure to find a body was explained by the natural environment, concealing evidence, or the search not being wide enough. This hypothesis had the advantage of not requiring identification of a specific perpetrator, not creating pressure to expand the investigation beyond the familiar community, and thus easily accepted as a neutral explanation for the complete disappearance. However, like the lost hypothesis, the accident one also lacked specific anchors, no physical evidence, no signs William had directly approached a dangerous area, and no statements confirming he was near those locations at the critical time, making it exist more as a logical gap than a perceivable direction. In the context where both hypotheses provided no satisfactory answer but were safe enough to maintain, the abduction hypothesis became the most difficult, as seriously considering it meant acknowledging William might have been approached and taken deliberately, quickly, and discreetly by an adult, changing the case's nature and requiring expansion beyond what was controlled. Evaluating abduction from the start faced many barriers. First, the absence of classic signs like ransom demands, perpetrator contact, or direct witnesses to coercion, factors seen as necessary to elevate a missing person case to serious crime in that era's investigative thinking. Additionally, no violence traces at the scene and no clearly abnormal reactions from witnesses made this hypothesis seem too speculative, lacking basis for prioritization given limited resources. The reason for not prioritizing abduction also lay in strategic allocation. Once placed at the top, the investigation would shift to a completely different mode, focusing on opportunity, motive, and access by external subjects, while acknowledging the case could drag on beyond normal handling. Without direct evidence, making that shift was seen as risky, both professionally and for public expectations. As a result, abduction was not fully discarded but pushed to backup status, mentioned in the file only as a remote possibility to consider if other directions dead-ended. and this ranking directly influenced how information was collected and interpreted. Details suggesting external intervention, already faint from the witness phase, became even easier to overlook, without a strong hypothetical frame to keep them in view, while data fitting lost or accident were prioritized. The consequence was not just one hypothesis being downplayed, but the entire investigative thinking structure gradually locking in, as each new decision built on old assumptions, creating a self-reinforcing loop, where lack of evidence for abduction justified not investigating it, while not investigating reduced the chance of finding evidence. Over time, the case file clearly reflected this bias, with most documents focused on geography, environment, and random factors, while questions about how William was approached, who might have exploited adult oversight, or how quickly the disappearance occurred were not developed into independent directions. Not prioritizing abduction also affected witness questioning, as follow-ups focused more on where William might have gone alone, rather than who was around him at the critical time, making details about strangers or unusual situations harder to explore deeply. Gradually, the initial hypothesis, though uncertain, became the official reference frame, and any information not fitting it risked being seen as outlier or error, leading to important possibilities being removed from the investigative orbit earliest. In that context, William's case did not move closer to a clear resolution, but only became more administratively defined, existing in limbo between hypotheses too weak to conclude and too strong to discard. And this bias in evaluating and prioritizing hypotheses left profound consequences, not only affecting immediate decisions, but laying the foundation for subsequent choices, narrowing the path to truth, and making reversal increasingly difficult. From the direct consequence of the initial hypothesis failing to provide a satisfactory resolution yet continuing to dominate the overall direction, authorities were forced to expand the search beyond the original residential area, a step both reactive to time pressure and reflecting a tacit admission that William might have left the familiar space in a way not previously accounted for. The search radius widened in concentric circles, from nearby streets to less frequented areas, vacant lots, abandoned construction sites, canal banks, and places a child might reach if traveling farther than expected, though this expansion still relied mainly on the logic of existing hypotheses rather than a fundamental approach change. Alongside geographic expansion, police began receiving increasing reports from the public about sightings of a boy matching William's description in various locations, calls and tips coming from across the region, each carrying hope it might be the clue to finding him, but also posing a major verification challenge, as most descriptions were vague, based on fleeting impressions or memories influenced by widely circulated information. Some reports claimed William was seen with an unidentified adult, others insisted he was alone, while some described him in locations that, per the current timeline, were nearly impossible to reach in the short time. These contradictions required the team to allocate significant resources to check each tip, despite uneven credibility. The influx of sighting reports gradually dispersed the investigation, as each new tip had to be considered to some degree to avoid missing a critical clue, but pursuing too many directions diluted focus and drained already limited resources. Investigators constantly moved between locations, checking reports mostly later deemed unrelated, while initial search areas still yielded no clear results, creating a sense the investigation was very active, but progress disproportionate. In that context, noise clues grew denser, from mistaken reports confusing other children, to information embellished by anxiety or desire to contribute. Even cases where tipsters inadvertently or deliberately exaggerated details to make their story notable, all contributing to a fog of information enveloping the investigation. Some clues initially promising could not be verified due to lack of supporting witnesses or physical evidence, while others, though deemed false, left enough doubt that investigators could not fully dismiss them, causing hypotheses to stretch rather than narrow. Handling these noise clues not only slowed progress but affected overall data evaluation, as with too much conflicting information, distinguishing signal from noise grew harder, especially without a strong hypothetical frame for effective filtering. Gradually, the expanded search entered a phase where each advance came with loss of focus, as forces split to check different directions, while coordination and synthesis declined, making key details easy to miss amid growing data volume. Under that pressure, the team began gradually narrowing possibilities, not by finding decisive evidence, but by eliminating repeatedly checked directions yielding no results. Search areas were marked cleared, citing reports categorized by reliability, and many directions cautiously closed. This narrowing was pragmatic rather than conclusive, reflecting resource and time limits, but also reduced the ability to revisit sidelined clues if new information emerged later. As the search radius narrowed, the overall case picture did not clarify, but only showed what did not happen. William was not found in checked places. Most sightings were unreliable, and initial hypotheses were neither fully refuted nor strengthened. In that state, the investigation moved forward with a growing heaviness that each passing day brought no new answers, but only increased the distance between William's disappearance and the chance of finding him, setting the stage for a phase where searching was no longer unlimited expansion, but confronting the limits of what had and had not been verified. From the increasingly clear feeling that expanding the search no longer yielded additional answers, but only exposed the limits of what had already been examined, the investigation was forced to return to a more synthetic step, reviewing all the clues collected over the past period in the hope that by placing them side by side once more, some hidden logic would emerge. Field reports, witness statements, search area maps, tip calls, and scattered notes were brought back to the desk, reclassified by time, location, and reliability, an effort to restructure the case picture that had been fragmented by too many parallel directions. In this review process, clues once considered secondary were re-examined, not because they had suddenly become clearer, but because other investigative directions had been exhausted, making any detail not fully exploited a candidate for a potential turning point. It was in that context that a subject began to emerge as a viable suspect, not from direct evidence, but from the intersection of many small details that had previously not been connected. This person's presence in the area at the critical time, indirect statements suggesting access to William, and certain behaviors that could not be clearly explained by hypotheses of getting lost or an accident. Identifying this suspect was more inferential than conclusive, based on gradually eliminating other possibilities, but sufficient to prompt the investigative team to focus resources on checking the background, travel habits, and related relationships. As the suspect's file was opened, the factors that drew attention to this person simultaneously revealed the greatest weakness of the new investigative direction, for there was no direct witness who saw a clear interaction between the suspect and William, no physical evidence linking the two, and the timing information, though suggesting suspicious coincidence, was still not precise enough to meet the legal standards required for further steps. Interrogations were conducted within permitted frameworks, but they only yielded evasive or denying answers, without creating clear contradictions to exploit, and while some details left investigators unconvinced, they still did not cross the threshold of reasonable doubt. The lack of forensic evidence became the biggest barrier, because even though the suspect could remain in professional suspicion, continuing to pursue without a solid foundation could easily lead to mistakes or backfire, especially in a case that had already dragged on and faced pressure from multiple sides. When efforts to gather more information yielded no results, the suspect's status gradually shifted in a way unfavorable to the investigation. This person left the area, no longer living or working in Florida, and tracking became much more difficult in the context of federal and federal-local information systems not yet effectively connected, as they would be later. The suspect's disappearance from reach was not recorded as clear flight behavior, but was explained by various other possibilities, from job changes, relocations, to unrelated personal reasons, and that very ambiguity prevented the investigative team from taking stronger action. When a potential suspect was no longer within control, this investigative direction gradually lost momentum, not because it was disproved, but because there were no longer tools to advance further, and the case fell back into a state of lacking support. At the same time, the comprehensive review of all clues yielded no other breakthrough discoveries. Sightings of the victim continued to be classified as unreliable, old hypotheses were not further strengthened, and no new evidence was strong enough to open a completely different direction. Investigators began facing the reality that despite having tried every reasonable path within available resources and data, the case still did not move closer to a clear resolution, and each subsequent step seemed only to repeat what had been done before with similar results. In that context, internal meetings increasingly focused on assessing the feasibility of continuing active investigation, weighing the maintenance of effort in the absence of new clues against the risk of wasting resources needed for other cases, a difficult but unavoidable equation in investigative practice. The stagnation of the investigation did not happen suddenly, but was the result of a slow process. As directions successively closed, suspicions could not be elevated to legal action, and the absence of new information made each passing day resemble the previous one. For the family, this slowdown was perceived as a withdrawal, but for the investigative force, it was a sign that the case had reached the limits of what could be done under current conditions. When there were no longer clues to pursue, no suspect within control, and no evidence strong enough to open a new strategy, the investigation fell into a true deadlock, not due to lack of effort, but because every viable path had been tried, and all led to dead ends, leaving a file that thickened over time but remained poor in progress, and a growing gap between William's disappearance and the ability to find the answers everyone was seeking. The investigation, after reaching the point where every approach circled back to the same old questions, began entering a quiet but decisive transitional phase. When within the authorities, there emerged a consensus that the William Rodriguez case no longer met the conditions to continue being handled as an active investigation. There was no official announcement moment or sudden decision made public, but rather a series of quiet administrative evaluations where investigators had to confront the reality that there were no new clues, no suspect within control, and no legal basis to maintain high-priority status for a file that had been reviewed multiple times without progress. The decision to close the active investigation was formed on the foundation of professional fatigue and resource limits, reflecting a system logic where each case, no matter how personally meaningful to the victim's family, still had to be placed within the overall picture of hundreds of other cases awaiting attention. As the case's status changed, regular search activities ceased, dedicated meetings were no longer held periodically, and William's file was moved from the investigator's desk to a standardized storage process, marking the end of a phase where every day was seen as potentially bringing a breakthrough. The file archiving process followed regulations precisely, with the compilation of all related documents from field reports, witness statements, search maps to investigative notes. But it was at this step that the accumulated deficiencies throughout the investigation began to become clearer, not because someone actively re-reviewed the content, but because systematization forced confrontation with gaps that previously could be obscured by the pace of work. Some important information existed only as scattered notes, not standardized in official reports. Some timelines were recorded approximately without context or reliability levels, and some statements were summarized to the point of losing initial details that once made them noteworthy. These discrepancies and omissions were not treated as issues needing correction before archiving, because the goal of this phase was not to improve investigative quality, but to complete administrative procedures for handover, and thus they were frozen along with the entire documentation, becoming an inseparable part of the cold case file. When the file was placed in storage, it was no longer a living set of documents updated daily, but became a static entity, only retrieved for sufficiently strong reasons, and in that state, Every assumption, every decision, and every discrepancy from the prior phase was preserved intact. For the authorities, this was a necessary step to free up resources, but for the Rodriguez family, it carried entirely different meaning, because the end of active investigation meant they no longer had an official mechanism to force the case to remain at high attention. When informed of this status change, the family reacted with strong opposition, not because they failed to understand the administrative logic, but because they clearly felt that transitioning to cold case was a boundary where hope of finding William was no longer supported by the regular presence of police and tangible search activities. The family's opposition efforts took many forms, from requesting meetings with the lead investigator, submitting petitions to higher levels, to trying to attract local media attention, in the hope that public pressure could force the system to keep the case open. However, these oppositions yielded no concrete results, because within legal and professional frameworks, there were no criteria allowing maintenance of an active investigation when no new clues existed, and the responses the family received, though presented with empathy, still revolved around the same message that the case was not permanently closed, but could not continue in the old way. The family's helplessness before this decision stemmed not only from inability to change it, but also from the feeling that mistakes, wrong assumptions, and discarded information from the early phase had now become a fixed part of the file, with no opportunity for serious re-examination. As time passed, the file lying in storage caused William's disappearance to gradually detach from the current flow of investigative work, becoming a matter of the past, mentioned mainly in summary reports, or when someone actively retrieved it. The transition to cold case also created a subtle shift in how the case was perceived, no longer a question needing immediate answers, but an unresolved issue that could be reopened if conditions allowed, without any specific timeline or commitment. In this state, the file's deficiencies not only persisted but risked being forgotten, because the fewer people accessed the documents, the lower the chance of recognizing and correcting discrepancies, causing the file to gradually become a closed structure, difficult to access and interpret for anyone not directly involved from the start. For the Rodriguez family, their unsuccessful opposition marked a new phase of pain, where they had to learn to live with the system's silence. No more regular update calls, no more search activities they could witness, only a vague promise that the case would be reviewed if new information emerged. The decision to transition to cold case, therefore, was not just an administrative status change, but a psychological and structural turning point, where all prior efforts were packaged away, all unanswered questions left hanging, and William Rodriguez's case entered a phase of silent existence, where time became the most dominant factor, not by bringing answers, but by gradually blurring the boundaries between what was known, what was missed, and what might never be clarified without a sufficiently strong external trigger. The prolonged silence of the investigative file did not mean William's story ended, because while the case was frozen in storage archives, the life of the 6-year-old boy from that time continued to flow elsewhere, under a different identity, in a reality completely detached from what the Rodriguez family once knew, and what the investigative system recorded. William grew up without any awareness that he was the center of an unsolved missing person case, unaware that his real name was tied to searches, appeals, and a lingering emptiness for many years. The identity he carried was not built on a clear story of origins, but existed as a given in daily life, sufficient to help him integrate, but not enough to answer deeper questions about himself. In the new living environment, everything operated under different rules, different habits, and William, as a growing child, adapted to his surroundings, like anyone else, learning to accept what was given without basis for doubt, because for a child, identity is not something to prove but something assumed through family, documents, and how people address him. There were no clear memories of the disappearance, no coherent images of the prior period, only scattered sensory fragments, not specific enough to be recognized as memories, and thus not strong enough to create suspicion. What William knew about himself was formed gradually through the accounts of those around him, through the new living environment, school, work, and relationships, all creating a coherent personal story in the present, even if lacking the beginning. The new living environment bore no clear signs of concealment, nor signals that would easily alert outsiders to anything unusual about William's identity, because foundational details, like name, date of birth, and family circumstances, though not built on a complete record, were consistent enough to avoid direct conflicts in daily life. William grew up in a social space where the past was not questioned, where people accepted each other based on current presence more than origins, and that very fact normalized living under a different identity, not due to intent to hide, but because there was no reason to dig deeper. However, even without awareness of the case, and without questioning his own identity, subtle abnormalities still existed, appearing sporadically in William's life, in ways that only in retrospect could be recognized. At the time, they were seen merely as insignificant isolated details. There were moments when William felt he did not fully belong to the family story he was living, not as conflict or dissatisfaction, but as a vague sense that something did not fit, as if some puzzle pieces in his life picture were placed nearly correctly, but not perfectly. These feelings were not strong enough to form conscious suspicion, because they were easily overwhelmed by the need to fit in, by daily life pressures, and by the reality that no specific evidence existed to support a vague thought. In the new environment, William learned to adapt to social norms, build relationships, face challenges, and opportunities like anyone else, and this very normality made his story hard to detect from outside, as there were no dramatic or tragic signs to draw attention. However, the initial abnormalities continued to accumulate over time, not as major events, but as small details related to documents, origins, and questions no one fully answered. There were times William noticed that basic information about himself was not presented consistently, that dates or places related to his birth were sometimes mentioned differently, but those differences were often explained as harmless mistakes, or adults' imprecise memory, and in a context with no clear reason to doubt, William accepted those explanations as part of reality. The new environment also played a key role in blurring the potential for questioning, by providing William enough stability to not need to probe the past, enough relationships to avoid isolation, and enough present responsibilities for the past to become a luxury rarely considered. The abnormalities, therefore, coexisted with a seemingly complete life, without causing clear ruptures, but creating a fragile foundation where any sufficiently strong trigger could expose long-accumulated inconsistencies. Throughout that time, William had no idea that elsewhere his real name was linked to a file marked unresolved, that questions about his disappearance still lived in his birth family's memory, and that the normality of his current life could only persist due to the complete separation from the past. Living under a different identity was not perceived as falsehood, because for William, it was the only identity he knew, the basis for building himself, for understanding who he was in the surrounding world, and the lack of awareness of the case allowed that life to continue uninterrupted by unanswerable questions. The initial abnormalities, therefore, did not lead to personal action or investigation, but existed only as small ripples on the surface of a relatively stable life, not enough to change direction, but enough to persist as a silent reminder that something in this story did not fully align. In that state, William continued to live, grow, and pass through life's stages, without knowing that his very existence, elsewhere, and under a different identity, was the strongest refutation of the assumption that the old case was merely an inexplicable disappearance, even though he himself had no awareness of that connection, and no reason to suspect that his life was operating on a foundation different from what he believed to be true. The unusual signs that had previously existed only as vague feelings in William's daily life gradually became more evident as he entered stages where personal identity was no longer just about how people addressed him, but became a collection of documents, numbers, and data required to interact with administrative, legal, and social systems, and it was here that the gaps, previously concealed by familiarity, began to surface. William's personal documents were not entirely complete in the usual way, not to the extent that they would be immediately rejected, but in that they lacked the continuity typical of standard records, with some documents issued sporadically at different phases of his life, failing to form a consistent chain from birth to the present. In many cases, these shortcomings did not cause immediate obstacles, as administrative systems often allowed for supplementation or replacement of documents with reasonable justification, and neither William nor those around him had grounds to suspect that this incompleteness was a sign of a deeper issue. However, when the documents were placed side by side, inconsistencies began to appear, particularly regarding date of birth and origin, information considered foundational, yet not fully matching across the records. William's date of birth, in some files, was recorded in ways that were not entirely uniform, with minor discrepancies large enough to be overlooked in everyday life, but significant enough to become problematic when precise verification was needed, while details about place of birth or circumstances of birth were presented vaguely, lacking the specific details typically found in original records. These contradictions were often explained by familiar administrative reasons, such as recording errors, changes in regulations over time, or reuse of information from secondary sources, and in a context without pressure to clarify. Those explanations were accepted as part of the unavoidable complexity of paperwork systems. Another notable point was that many important documents in William's identity seemed to have been created later than the time when they should have existed, as if his personal record had not been built concurrently with his growth, but rather supplemented gradually as needed, each time addressing a specific requirement rather than reflecting a continuous history. Delayed record creation is not uncommon in certain circumstances, but here it created a significant gap in the early years, where foundational documents should have existed but were entirely absent or replaced only by copies of unclear origin. The absence of original records became the most critical element of the inconsistency, as no document could be definitively identified as the starting point of William's identity. No original birth certificate with full details, no newborn medical records, or equivalent to confirm later notations. Instead, foundational information appeared to be constructed based on declarations or secondary documents, sufficient to meet administrative requirements, but not enough to create a solid foundation. For a long time, this inconsistency did not lead to any specific action, as William had no practical reason to deeply inquire into his origins, and the surrounding system did not impose demands requiring clarification, as long as the existing documents fulfilled immediate functions. Minor differences in dates, gaps in records, or the lack of original documents were seen as acceptable inconveniences, not enough to disrupt a relatively stable life. However, the parallel existence of incomplete, contradictory, and belatedly created documents made William's identity a structure vulnerable to collapse under close scrutiny, as it lacked the internal cohesion that other identities typically possess. Each document, when considered individually, could be deemed valid, but when related to one another, they did not form a unified story of William's origins and personal formation. This did not create an immediate crisis, but it planted the seeds for a latent instability, where identity was no longer an immutable entity, but a collection of information open to questioning. The absence of original records also meant there was no anchor for verification, no document authoritative enough to serve as a standard when contradictions arose, making any efforts at clarification, if undertaken, reliant on secondary records that were already inconsistent from the start. In this context, William's identity existed as a smooth surface covering an internal structure full of voids, sturdy enough to withstand ordinary life demands, but not solid enough to endure rigorous examination. Although William had not yet fully grasped the implications of these shortcomings, the inconsistencies in documents and origins had quietly laid the groundwork for his identity to be questioned, not as an isolated personal issue, but as an inevitable consequence of a life built on disjointed data, where each piece was valid in its own scope, but never assembled into a complete picture. The inconsistency in documents and origins, though not yet causing a clear crisis, began to reflect back into William's inner life in a subtle and elusive way, as vague memories appeared sporadically that did not fit the story of the environment he had been told about, not specific enough to be named childhood memories, yet not entirely dismissible as fiction. There were fragmented images unconnected to his current context, familiar sensations without clear reasons, like a snippet of sound, a taste, a fleeting space in the mind, all existing as isolated pieces that could not be integrated into the official memory timeline William had constructed about his life. These memories did not appear frequently, nor were they strong enough to dominate behavior, but they recurred in inexplicable ways, sometimes making William feel that there was a part of the past that did not belong to the story he had lived and been told. Notably, these vague memory fragments did not align with his current living environment or places he had been attached to. They did not match the geography, spaces, or pace of life he knew, as if drawn from an entirely different context, one no longer present in his current reality. This mismatch was not clear enough to be immediately recognized, as human memory is inherently imperfect and prone to distortion over time, but when juxtaposed with the deficiencies in documents and records, it created a subtle sense of misalignment, where both external data and internal experiences did not fully coincide. In daily life, William tended to ignore these sensations, as they offered no practical benefit and were not encouraged to be explored deeply, especially in an environment where the past was not seen as a topic needing questioning. Mismatched details, whether in memories or in stories told about his origins, were often brushed aside as minor errors, not worth disrupting a relatively stable life. However, continually ignoring these details did not make them disappear, but merely pushed them to a lower level of awareness, where they lingered as unspoken questions. There were moments when William realized he reacted strongly and inexplicably to certain situations, reactions disproportionate to his current life experiences, as if triggered by a deeper memory he could not directly access. These reactions were not identified as signs of trauma or abnormality, as they were rarely expressed outwardly in a clear way, but they contributed to reinforcing the feeling that there was a layer of memory detached from the mainstream of consciousness. The information about origins that William received from those around him also did not fully match what he sensed, not because it directly contradicted, but because it lacked depth, lacking the specific details that a personal life story typically has. Vague answers, brief explanations about birth circumstances or early years were never expanded, never recounted vividly, making William's past exist as a void covered by minimal information. These gaps, initially, did not raise suspicion, as they were seen as normal in many families, but over time, they became more noticeable when placed alongside vague memories of undetermined origin. The omitted details were not only in the origin story, but also in how those around him avoided certain topics, redirecting conversation, or ending it quickly when questions went too deep, creating an invisible boundary that William sensed but lacked the information to cross. This avoidance was not dramatic or overt, no prohibitions or open conflicts, but existed as subtle signals, enough to discourage deeper probing, but not enough to draw attention. Over time, William learned not to ask further, not because he believed answers did not exist, but because he sensed further questioning was not expected, and in the context of wanting to fit in and maintain stability, He chose to accept what was given. Signs of a concealed identity, therefore, did not present as a closely guarded secret, but as a structure built to avoid scrutiny, where all details needed for daily functioning were provided, but anything beyond the necessary was not. This concealment did not necessarily stem from malicious intent or a deliberate current plan, but could be the consequence of decisions made long ago, decisions that those living with William now simply inherited without questioning. For William, this created a vague sense of self, not as a distinct identity crisis, but as a simmering awareness that something in his story remained untold. The vague memories, mismatched information, and omitted details combined into a fragile psychological foundation, where identity was built on what was available, but always at risk of shaking if a new piece emerged. Throughout this period, William did not actively seek answers, not because he lacked curiosity, but because no sign was strong enough to turn curiosity into action, and because current life still provided enough reasons to move forward without looking back. However, the parallel existence of vague memories and information gaps created a latent state of waiting, where William's identity was not fully sealed, but resembled a temporary structure, able to stand under normal conditions, but easily disrupted, if struck at the right point. The signs of a concealed identity, thus, were not an obvious secret, but a series of small misalignments accumulated over time, enough to persist undetected, but also enough to at some point raise major questions about who William really is, and whether the life story he believed truly began where he thought it did. The gaps in memory, and inconsistencies in identity, though simmering for many years, only truly emerged from ambiguity when William faced a completely personal and practical need, unrelated to the past or any doubts about origins: the desire to access his own biological information in a context where DNA testing technology had become more widespread and accessible than ever. The decision to undergo DNA testing did not stem from suspicion about identity, nor was it tied to intentions of searching for biological family or uncovering a secret, but simply a personal choice, driven by scientific curiosity and health care, a way to better understand genetic factors that might affect him. In William's mind, this test was no different from other increasingly common information services, a tool providing data, rather than a key unlocking a door to the past. When accessing commercial DNA databases, William entered a system designed to compare genetic information from millions of individuals, where data is processed automatically, matched against other samples to determine similarity levels and potential blood relations. Submitting the sample and waiting for results proceeded as a technical procedure, carrying no particular expectations, and throughout the process, William did not imagine that this action could impact questions about identity he had previously avoided. Accessing the DNA database, in this context, was one-directional. William provided his biological information to receive a set of analyzed data, not to search for someone or connect to an unknown family story. There was no goal of finding relatives, no list of people to verify, and no assumption that results would reveal anything beyond general genetic and health information. This absence of intent made the step even more notable, as it eliminated the possibility that any surprising results were products of personal desire or bias. When the test results were returned, William's initial reaction was not panic or shock, but a nameless confusion, as what was displayed did not fully align with the story he believed about himself. The genetic data, instead of confirming foundational assumptions, presented contradictory signals, not directly negating current identity, but enough to question its completeness. Indicators of blood relations did not show the expected matches with what William had been told about his origins, instead suggesting connections not mentioned in the family story he knew. The results did not appear as a clear answer, but as a set of data, requiring interpretation, where each number and similarity ratio carried potential meaning, but did not itself tell a complete story. In that moment, the previously ignored unusual signs began to rearrange into a new order, not through emotion, but through data logic, as inconsistent documents, vague memories, and information gaps were now placed alongside objective biological evidence. William did not immediately conclude that his identity was false, as the DNA results did not directly state that, but they were enough to shake the belief that the current story was complete. And this shaking created a new state of awareness, where continuing to avoid questions became harder than before. The lack of intent to find relatives led William to approach the results cautiously, not rushing to dramatic interpretations, but trying to understand them within technical and statistical frameworks. Yet even with that lens, doubts could not be fully dismissed. Some data indicated the existence of blood connections at certain levels, but did not match any relationships William could identify in his current life, creating a paradox where DNA pointed to connections, but social reality provided no corresponding counterparts. This paradox made the test results impossible to dismiss as technical error or exception, as the indicators were consistent enough to reflect a biological reality, even if that reality remained unexplained. In this context, DNA testing was no longer a passive information tool, but became an agent triggering awareness, forcing William to confront the possibility that gaps in records and memories were not mere inconveniences, but signs of an unknown story. However, William still lacked enough data to move from doubt to action, as the test results, though suggestive, did not point to a specific direction. No names, locations, or clear timelines, only questions about the integrity of current identity. Accessing the DNA database, in this case, was like opening a door to a hallway full of mirrors, where each reflection showed a different possibility, but no signpost indicated which way to go. William did not rush to share the results with those around him, not out of fear or concealment, but because he himself did not yet know how to interpret them, and presenting unclear information could cause unnecessary disruption. In that silence, the DNA results continued to exist as an external element in William's life, not directly controlling behavior, but quietly altering how he viewed what had once been taken for granted. Questions about origins, previously avoided for lack of basis, now had a new anchor, not from memory or documents but from biological data, and that made them harder to ignore than ever. This turning point did not unfold as an explosive moment, but as a gradual shift in perception, where William began to understand that his identity might not just be a personal story, but a data issue, traceable, comparable, and verifiable in ways previously non-existent. The DNA results, therefore, did not provide immediate answers, but shattered the fragile equilibrium William had maintained, forcing him to accept that the unusual signs were no longer harmless ripples, but signals leading to a different reality, one he was not yet ready to face, but could no longer ignore. In that moment, the past, previously completely detached from current life, began to find its way back through science, not via memory or narrative, but through cold, undeniable data sequences. Laying the foundation for a change William could not yet predict, but knew would force him to revisit his entire life story under entirely different light. The initial DNA data, though not providing a direct answer, triggered a chain reaction that William could not fully control, as the analysis system continued to update and cross-reference his biological sample with an ever-expanding database, gradually revealing the existence of distant blood relations that he had never known about before. The new results did not appear as an immediate shock, but were added piece by piece, with each notification showing a level of genetic similarity low enough that no close relationship could be determined, but high enough to rule out randomness, suggesting that somewhere in the data network there were people who shared a biological origin with William. These connections came without stories or context, just numbers and percentages, but when placed alongside the inconsistencies in his documents and memories, they began to form a new pattern, one in which William's identity was no longer an isolated entity, but part of a broader, unexplored network. The discovery of distant relatives did not immediately lead to specific action, as the genetic distance made precise relationship identification complicated, and William remained cautious in interpreting the data, avoiding hasty conclusions without sufficient information. However, the existence of these connections raised an unavoidable question: if his current identity was complete and accurate, why were there blood ties that could not be explained by the family story he knew? As the data continued to update, some similarities began to align in more notable ways, not just genetically, but also in terms of geography and timing, factors that William had not initially paid attention to, but that became prominent when viewed in the same context. It was this convergence that led William to consider the possibility that his DNA data might be linked to an old story, one not part of his personal memories, but stored in records somewhere, beyond the scope of his lived experience. When some basic information from the database was cross-referenced with public sources, matches began to emerge between the genetic connections and past records of missing children, not at a level sufficient for immediate confirmation, but enough to make the hypothesis no longer pure speculation. The data, when placed side by side, showed significant similarities in age, location and time gaps that aligned, creating an intersection that had not previously existed between William's current life and an unresolved old case. This realization did not emerge as a firm conclusion, but as a possibility that needed verification, and it was that need for verification that led to the next important step, when William decided to contact the authorities to seek assistance in interpreting and confirming the data. This contact was not made in a spirit of assertion or accusation, but as a request for information, a way to ask whether the genetic matches he had discovered related to any records in the system. For the authorities, receiving this information followed a cautious procedure, as commercial DNA data is not automatically considered legal evidence, and any conclusions must be placed in the context of official records and strict verification standards. However, as the basic information was cross-checked, the similarity between William's DNA data and an old cold case file began to stand out more clearly, no longer just an abstract possibility, but a specific point of suspicion strong enough to draw the attention of those in authority. The file was pulled from storage, not because of immediate new evidence, but because the DNA data provided a reasonable basis for re-examination, a factor that had not existed before, and thus could not have been applied during the initial investigation. When the old information was placed alongside the new data, details previously seen as disjointed or unimportant began to take on different meaning, not because they had changed, but because the context around them had shifted, and that shift highlighted connections that could not previously be seen. The involvement of the authorities marked a significant shift, as the case which had existed in the silence of storage now began to regain internal attention, not as an overdue obligation, but as a case with potential to be clarified through modern technology. The initial exchanges focused on determining the reliability of the DNA data, how it was collected, and the possibility of comparing it to biological samples or information available in the old file, a technical but highly cautious process, as any error could lead to mistaken conclusions. As the verification steps continued, the case gradually came up again in internal meetings, no longer just a name on a long list of cold cases, but a file with a new element sufficient to justify investing time and resources. This renewed attention was not explosive or public, but occurred in a controlled manner, reflecting the system's caution in handling sensitive information related to identity and personal history. For William, having his DNA data become the bridge between the present and an old case brought an indescribable feeling, not complete confirmation, but no longer a vague doubt, as the anomalies in his life now had a clear convergence with a larger story. The intersection of DNA and the cold case was not just a technical event, but the moment when two timelines, once completely separate, began to overlap, where the biological data of a person living in the present touched the unanswered questions of the past. When the case regained attention, it not only changed how the authorities viewed the file, but also altered Williams' position in the story, from an individual facing doubts about his own identity to a central factor in reactivating a forgotten case. This attention did not bring immediate answers, but it created new momentum, a space where questions could be asked anew, no longer limited by the assumptions and shortcomings of the past. In that state, the case once frozen in storage began to emerge from silence, not with a complete resolution, but with a clear signal that what had been considered unsolvable could be re-examined in the light of modern technology and data, and that Williams' existence, elsewhere, and under a different identity, had inadvertently become the catalyst for the past and present to meet at a point no one could ignore. The internal attention returning to the case did not remain at the level of technical suspicion, but quickly led to a clear professional decision, as William Rodriguez's 1972 file was pulled from storage, for the first time in decades, for a comprehensive review from an entirely new perspective. Bringing the file out of archive status was not just an administrative action, but an acknowledgement that the new data was strong enough to disrupt the old equilibrium, forcing the system to confront the possibility that previous conclusions may not have fully reflected reality. When the files were reopened, documents once stamped as closed were spread out on the desks of modern investigators, from initial reports, witness statements, search diagrams, to scattered notes previously deemed secondary, all placed back into the same analytical space, no longer separated by time or old assumptions. The process of matching old and new data proceeded systematically, starting with comparing the DNA information to the identity data recorded in the 1972 file, not to seek an absolute match immediately, but to identify potential intersections between two sets of information created in completely different contexts. As investigators placed the timelines, locations, and personal descriptions from the old file alongside the current biological and administrative data, discrepancies once seen as internal contradictions began to appear as signals needing explanation, no longer dismissed simply because they did not fit the initial assumption. Some details in the old file, previously marked as unreliable or unverifiable, were now re-evaluated in new light, as the DNA data provided an objective anchor for reassessing their value. Statements once considered vague because they did not match the old timeline were now placed in a more flexible time frame, allowing for the possibility that the original timeline may have been constructed incorrectly from the start. Clues previously discarded, not because they were wrong, but because they could not be explained in the context of that era's investigation, began to gain importance when connected to the new data, as if they had been waiting for the right key to unlock them. This matching process did not aim to find a single detail that could solve the entire case, but was one of accumulation, where each small point was re-examined, each assumption questioned, and each old decision reviewed under modern standards. In that process, the differences between 1972 investigation methods and modern methods became clear, not just in technology, but in approaches to data and tolerance for uncertainty. As modern investigators were no longer bound by the need to quickly lock in a hypothesis and could allow multiple possibilities to coexist until the data was sufficient to eliminate them. Clues once set aside due to lack of physical evidence, such as sightings of the victim or inconsistent statements, were now re-evaluated, not based on their completeness, but on how well they fit the emerging biological and administrative data. Some minor details, once seen as noise, began to form repeating patterns when placed together, suggesting that Williams' disappearance may have occurred in a way entirely different from what the old file described. As the modern investigation truly began to operate, The focus was no longer on recreating every old search step, but on identifying key points where new data could change the understanding of the case, thereby rebuilding an analytical framework suited to both past and present. Investigators applied modern tools and methods to reorganize the information, using data management systems to track connections between details rather than relying on personal memory or scattered notes as before, creating a more flexible analytical structure, less dependent on initial assumptions. Reopening the file also meant acknowledging that some past decisions, though made in good faith and under limited conditions, may have contributed to misdirecting the investigation, and this acknowledgement, though not publicly stated, played an important role in allowing modern investigators to approach the case with greater openness. Clues once discarded, because they did not fit the lost or accident hypothesis, were now considered from the angle of possible external intervention, not as a ready conclusion, but as a hypothesis to be tested with new data. The modern investigation process began by focusing on redefining what was considered certain and what was actually just assumption, clearly separating verified data from inferences once used to fill information gaps. In that context, the 1972 file was no longer seen as a completed story, but as a collection of historical data needing reinterpretation, where each page not only recorded what happened, but also reflected how people at that time understood and interpreted the events. Reopening the file, therefore, was not just a professional action, but a re-dialogue between past and present, where modern technology, data, and methods were used to ask new questions of old answers. As the modern investigation officially began, the case entered a completely different phase, no longer dominated by pressure to reach quick conclusions, but focused on clarifying each layer of information and each connection, with the awareness that the truth, if it existed in this file, may have been obscured, not by lack of effort, but by the limitations of the era in which it was first investigated. The file being reopened and placed under the lens of modern investigation quickly led to a central task: reconstructing the entire timeline of the case by combining old data with newly gathered information, not to fix individual details, but to understand how time had been shaped incorrectly from the beginning. Investigators began by dismantling the original timeline that had been used for decades, treating it not as an immutable foundation, but as a historical hypothesis needing re-verification, with each time marker examined independently. Each statement placed in the context of when it was recorded, and each gap marked no longer as a recording error, but as a point needing explanation. As DNA data and modern administrative information were introduced, assumptions once seen as reasonable began to reveal their fragility, since determining where William was at any given time could no longer rely solely on witness memory, but had to be compatible with realistic travel possibilities and external factors previously downplayed. Reconstructing the new timeline did not follow a simple linear path, but involved testing multiple different scenarios, each reflecting a different understanding of the critical minutes and hours before William disappeared, and allowing multiple timelines to coexist helped investigators identify points where the old timeline had been forced to fit the initial hypothesis. In that process, the flaws of the original investigation became clearer, not as personal mistakes, but as consequences of a system forced to make quick decisions under conditions of limited data and technology, leading to prioritizing the most acceptable assumptions over harder-to-prove possibilities. Re-evaluating these flaws showed that the old timeline had been built around the hypothesis of William getting lost or having an accident, and any data not fitting that frame was either discarded or reinterpreted so as not to break the overall structure, creating a version of events that appeared consistent but was actually based on selectively chosen pieces. When the foundational assumption was removed, clues once treated as exceptions gained a chance to be taken seriously, especially statements suggesting William may have left the area much earlier than initially assumed, or that his disappearance happened so quickly it left no trace within the traditional search radius. Identifying key points that were missed became the focus of the reconstruction, as investigators realized it was not a lack of clues, but that important clues had not been kept in view long enough to develop an independent investigative direction. One such key point involved how conflicting statements were handled. Instead of being seen as signs of a more complex event, they were flattened to serve a simple timeline, preventing the possibility of external intervention from developing into a separate hypothesis. The reconstruction also revealed that the initial search radius, though expanded over time, remained limited by how time was understood, because if William had left the area in a shorter and earlier window, the entire logic of searching based on a lost child's walking radius would no longer apply. These key points, when placed alongside the DNA data and new administrative records, began to form a different picture of the case, one in which William's disappearance was no longer the result of a random chain of events, but bore the characteristics of an organized action, though the method or motive could not yet be fully determined. Changing the understanding of the timeline led to a change in the nature of the case, no longer seen as an unexplained missing child, but as a structured event where time, location, and human behavior played central roles. This change was not declared hastily, but built gradually through eliminating assumptions that no longer fit and retaining possibilities that could explain the most data. As the nature of the case was reassessed, investigators realized that reconstruction was not just an academic exercise, but a necessary step to open new directions that could not have existed before, because continuing to rely on the old timeline would only repeat the dead ends already experienced. The process also exposed an unavoidable reality. Some investigative opportunities had been permanently lost due to the passage of time, unavailable witnesses, incomplete records, and changed social context, but at the same time, it showed that restructuring the understanding of the case still had value, as it allowed clearer identification of what had happened and what could not have happened. Shifting the case's nature from a vague disappearance to an event with signs of deliberate intervention did not mean all questions were answered, but it created a new analytical framework where DNA data, administrative records, and historical clues could be placed in logical relation to one another. In that framework, William was no longer just a lost child who was never found, but the center of a chain of decisions and actions whose full understanding required accepting that what had been considered certain might have been wrong from the start. As the reconstruction process reached a more stable phase, the case entered a new state, where investigators no longer tried to force data into an existing story, but allowed the story to form from the data, even if that meant facing difficult conclusions about how the case had been handled in the past. It was this shift, from protecting an old assumption to accepting the possibility it was flawed, that marked the true turning point in how the case was viewed, laying the foundation for an investigative phase whose goal was no longer to prove that what had been done was right, but to understand how the truth had been obscured, and why it could remain unrecognized for decades. From the moment the nature of the case had been reshaped, and the timeline reconstructed according to a new logic, the investigation advanced to a decisive step, where DNA data was no longer used merely as a suggestive element, but became the central tool for direct comparison with individuals identified as potential biological family members of William, a step that required high accuracy and strict adherence to current legal standards. The collection of comparative DNA samples was not carried out hastily, as it carried profound legal and personal consequences, not only for William but also for those potentially involved, and therefore every step was conducted within an official framework, with the participation of certified laboratories and independent verification processes. When the biological samples were compared, the resulting data was no longer probabilistic and vague, as in commercial databases, but provided clear results regarding blood relationships, scientifically confirming that William had a direct connection to the biological family recorded in the 1972 file. This match did not emerge as a controversial discovery, but as a firm conclusion, where the genetic markers reached a sufficiently high level to rule out the possibility of error, putting an end to doubts about whether William was truly the child who went missing that year. The DNA confirmation became the foundation for the next step, legal identity verification, a process that was not only technical but also required coordination among multiple agencies to update and adjust official records. William's legal identity, which had been built on inconsistent documents and lacking original records, now had to be cross-checked and merged with the true identity confirmed by biological data, a complicated step because it involved amending administrative documents that had existed for decades. This process required clearly defining the boundary between the current identity and the original one, not to completely erase the life William had lived, but to clarify its legal foundation, ensuring that the records reflected the truth without creating unintended legal consequences. Once the identity was legally confirmed, the status of the case file changed immediately, from a reopened cold case for review to a case with a clearly identified victim, no longer an unnamed missing child, but a living individual with an identity, history, and continuous existence in the present. This change forced the investigative system to update its perspective on the case, not only at the file level but also in classification and reporting, because identity confirmation meant that one of the biggest questions in the case had been answered. However, the change in file status did not bring a sense of complete closure, but opened up a series of new investigative consequences, as investigators had to reassess all the data in light of the newly confirmed truth. Assumptions previously considered possibilities were now repositioned as elements needing explanation, and past decisions, made under conditions of incomplete information, became subjects of analysis to understand why the case had dragged on for so long without resolution. Identity confirmation also raised questions about legal and professional responsibility, not in the direction of assigning blame, but toward drawing lessons from the limitations of the previous investigative system, particularly in handling missing persons cases without clear signs of violence. For the current investigation, the clearest consequence was a shift in priorities, where the focus was no longer on determining who the victim was, but on understanding what happened in the time gap between the disappearance and William's life under a different identity. However, identity confirmation also narrowed some investigative possibilities, as too much time had passed for certain legal actions to be feasible, and not every question could be answered with available data. The file status, though updated to reflect that the victim had been identified and was alive, still had to confront the reality that many other aspects of the case might never be fully clarified. For William, legal identity confirmation was not just an administrative procedure, but a fundamental shift in how he understood himself, as the life built on an incomplete story now had to be repositioned in relation to a past that had been severed. This confirmation did not erase the years lived under the other identity, but it required acknowledging them as part of a larger story, where identity was no longer taken for granted but became a truth that had just been uncovered. For the investigative agency, identity confirmation provided a solid anchor for continuing case analysis, but it also imposed clear limits, as not all consequences could be handled in the traditional manner of criminal justice. The file, though its status had changed, still contained gaps that could not be filled, questions that could not be answered with existing evidence, and the existence of those gaps became part of the investigative conclusion, reflecting the complexity of a case spanning decades. Identity confirmation, therefore, was not seen as the end point of the story, but as a transitional milestone, where a foundational truth had been clarified, allowing the system and those involved to review the entire case with new awareness, no longer obscured by doubts about the victim, but still having to confront the consequences of time, past decisions, and the unavoidable limits of investigating an event that occurred so long ago. From the moment William's identity had been confirmed by both biological and legal data, the investigation entered a new phase of professional summation, where investigators had to answer the remaining core question about the nature of the 1972 disappearance, and in the process of cross-referencing all the reconstructed data, the conclusion gradually formed that this was not a case of wandering off or an accident as previously assumed, but a swift, intentional abduction that was concealed skillfully enough to avoid attention in the initial hours. Determining the act of abduction was not based on a single decisive piece of evidence, but on the convergence of multiple factors. The new timeline showed William leaving the safe area earlier than initially estimated. Statements previously dismissed now aligned with the possibility of external intervention. The complete absence of physical traces was more consistent with a controlled action than a random event, and most importantly, the fact that William had lived under a different identity for a long time, something almost impossible without deliberate adult intervention. When investigators placed these factors side by side, the abduction hypothesis was no longer a backup option, but the most reasonable explanation for the entire chain of events, sufficient to reclassify the case professionally. However, determining the nature of the incident did not mean that the perpetrator could be prosecuted, as the passage of time had eroded almost the entire legal foundation necessary to bring anyone to criminal justice. Suspects mentioned in old files had either passed away or lacked sufficient data to verify direct connection to the case, while physical evidence, if it ever existed, had been lost, destroyed, or become unusable under modern legal standards. The lack of living witnesses who could provide reliable testimony, combined with the inability to precisely identify the identity and actions of the responsible party during the critical period, rendered any prosecution prospects unfeasible. Investigators had to acknowledge that, although the nature of the case had been clarified at a professional level, the criminal justice system no longer had the tools to handle the remainder in the traditional way, and any attempt at prosecution in that context risked failing to meet the required burden of proof in court. This infeasibility did not stem from lack of effort, but from the reality that time had created an insurmountable gap between historical truth and the demands of criminal justice, where evidence must meet strict criteria to protect the rights of all parties involved. In that context, criminal justice in the sense of pursuing individual accountability and imposing punishment could not be achieved, and this was a difficult conclusion to accept for both the family and those directly involved in the investigation, as it exposed the system's limits when facing cases spanning decades. Nevertheless, the inability to prosecute did not mean the case was considered a complete failure, because from an investigative perspective, identifying that the victim was alive, clarifying the nature of the act, and correcting past erroneous assumptions carried significant meaning in terms of truth and historical accountability. The case file was updated to reflect these conclusions, shifting status from an unsolved cold case to a partially resolved case, where the question about the victim had an answer, but the question about the perpetrator remained open. Updating the file was not just changing a status line, but formally recording that what was once believed possible had been disproven, that the nature of the case had been reinterpreted, and that the investigative system acknowledged its own limits in delivering a fully complete resolution. In internal reports, the case was reclassified with clear notes about the inability to continue prosecution due to lack of legal basis, while emphasizing the value of DNA data and modern investigation in clarifying cases thought unsolvable. For the family and those involved, the conclusion that the case was only partially resolved brought mixed emotions, as on one hand, they received confirmation that William did not disappear randomly, and that suspicions of intentional conduct were grounded, but on the other, they had to face the reality that no one would be held legally accountable for what happened. The absence of a trial, a verdict or a confession left a sense of incomplete justice, even though the basic truth had been clarified. For the investigative system, the case became a typical example of how justice is not always achievable through criminal proceedings, and that sometimes, the greatest value investigation can provide is truth, even if that truth does not lead to punishment. Updating the file with the new status also served an internal educational purpose, forcing authorities to review how missing persons cases were handled in the past, especially those without clear signs of violence, to avoid repeating errors that had allowed the case to linger unresolved. In its partially resolved state, the William Rodriguez case was no longer a complete question mark, but neither was it a closed story, as it existed on the boundary between confirmed truth and unattained justice. It was precisely this boundary that highlighted the complexity of cold cases, where discovering what happened does not always go hand in hand with the ability to address the person who caused it, and where the value of investigation sometimes lies in restoring identity, context and truth to the victim more than in delivering a final verdict. When the case was determined to be an abduction but prosecution was impossible, the investigative focus no longer lay in pursuing the perpetrator, but shifted to listening to and recording the victim's perspective, because in a context where criminal tools could no longer advance further, William's memories and experiences became the only living data source capable of supplementing a file that had been eroded by time. Approaching William's memories did not occur as an interrogation, but as a slow and cautious process, as investigators were well aware that memories after decades do not operate in a linear logic, and cannot be forced to provide complete answers. What William could recall was not a seamless sequence of events, but fragmented pieces, sensations, images, and bodily reactions triggered when confronted with certain specific information. Part of William's memories were confirmed to align with the reconstructed data, not at the level of detailed actions, but in background elements such as the feeling of being separated from the familiar environment, the appearance of a setting unrelated to the old neighborhood, and a state of complete dependence on adults during a period he could not precisely determine. These memory fragments, though insufficient to form legal testimony, held value in confirming that the disappearance was not the result of a random chain of events, but a controlled displacement, consistent with the professional conclusion of an abduction. When these details were cross-referenced with the old file, some information previously seen as vague began to gain additional weight, not because it became more accurate, but because it was placed alongside the victim's subjective experience, creating a compatibility that did not exist before. William could not provide names, locations, or a clear sequence of events, but what he remembered was enough to add to the file, a layer of information that administrative and scientific data could not replace: the human experience of being deprived of autonomy and identity during the formative stage of personality. This supplementary information was carefully recorded, not as evidence in the traditional sense, but as contextual data, helping explain why a child could exist for years under a different identity, without recognizing the discrepancy. However, alongside the partially confirmed memories were gaps that could not be filled, periods completely blank in William's memory, with no images, no sensations, no anchors to hold onto, and investigators had to accept that these gaps might remain permanent. The inability to fill them was not just a matter of time passed, but also a consequence of psychological protective mechanisms, where memory can be fragmented or pushed out of consciousness to allow the individual to continue living and adapting in the new circumstances. These gaps limited the ability to reconstruct case details while establishing a clear boundary between historical truth and personal experience, where not every question can be answered by memory, even if that memory belongs to the direct victim. Nevertheless, what William did not remember also held investigative significance, as the absence of specific memories about the transitional phase indicated a level of control and concealment great enough to prevent the formation of long-term memories, a characteristic often seen in cases where the victim is removed from the familiar environment and placed into a new, stable living structure sufficient to replace it. When investigators synthesized William's perspective with existing data, the case file gained a new layer of analysis, not aimed at pursuing legal accountability, but at better understanding the mechanism that allowed the disappearance and reappearance of the victim to occur in silence. In this process, another question gradually emerged, not from William's direct memories, but from the event pattern sketched through the data, whether this case was an isolated incident or part of a series of similar undetected acts. Certain characteristics of the case, such as how the new identity was maintained, the absence of traces, and the victim's long-term integration, suggested the possibility that similar methods might have been used in other cases, especially in an era when technology and data linkage systems were limited. The suggestion of other potential victims was not based on specific evidence about individuals, but on pattern logic, where a successful and undetected act over a long period might not have occurred only once. However, within the current scope of the case, this possibility was only noted as an analytical observation, insufficient to launch new investigations, but enough to place William's case in a broader context regarding systemic vulnerabilities in child protection and identity tracking. For William, sharing memories and experiences did not bring a sense of complete closure, as it did not answer who was responsible for what happened, but it allowed him to place the scattered memory fragments into a new framework of meaning, where they no longer existed as personal anomalies, but were understood as consequences of a confirmed event. Recording the victim's perspective also forced the investigative system to acknowledge that the truth of the case lies not only in documents and professional conclusions, but also in how the victim experienced and carried the aftermath of that event throughout life. In this state, the case file became more complete in its human dimension, even while lacking legal answers, reflecting the reality that resolving cold cases does not always mean closing every question, but sometimes merely shifting the focus from pursuit to understanding. The unfilled gaps, therefore, were not seen as investigative failure, but as the natural limits of attempting to reconstruct an event obscured by time and circumstances, and acknowledging those limits helped the case be viewed more honestly. When the victim's perspective was incorporated into the file as an official part of the story, the case was no longer just a collection of data about disappearance and reappearance, but became evidence of how identity, memory, and justice can be separated and reconnected in ways no one could predict, while leaving an open question about similar cases that might have occurred without ever being recognized. A question not intended to create unfounded suspicion, but to emphasize that the existence of a victim found after decades may only be the tip of a more complex reality, where not every story has the chance to be retold, and not every gap can be filled with data or memory. After the victim's perspective was recorded as an official part of the case file, the confirmation of family relations was no longer an abstract concept based on data or inference, but became an irreversible reality, when the final comparison results confirmed the blood relationship between William and his biological family, ending any remaining doubts about whether the life under a different identity had truly begun with an unlawful separation. This confirmation did not occur in a moment of emotional outburst, but was approached as a process requiring strict control, since both sides carried traumas, expectations, and fears accumulated over decades that could not be resolved simply by a scientific declaration. The initial contact was organized under restricted conditions, with the participation of psychological experts and agency representatives, to minimize the risk of reactivating old wounds and to avoid creating emotional pressure beyond the parties' tolerance. In that setting, the reunion did not take the form of a perfect meeting, but rather a cautious confrontation between people sharing the same blood, but who had lived completely separate lives, each carrying a different story of loss. For the biological family, William was not just a grown individual, but the embodiment of a child who had once vanished, an emptiness never filled in their memories and emotional lives. Meanwhile, for William, the people standing before him were both biologically familiar and experientially alien, representing a past he had not lived and was only beginning to understand. The controlled contact allowed the parties to re-establish boundaries, without forcing emotions to follow a predetermined script, instead creating space for recognition to unfold at its own pace, where silence, awkwardness, or internal conflict were all seen as normal responses. The initial meetings did not focus on recreating the past or seeking full explanations, as both sides recognized that no words could restore the lost years, and attempting to do so could cause further harm. Instead, the reunion process was built as a series of short, prepared contacts with evaluations after each one, allowing experts to monitor psychological impacts and adjust the approach as needed. Over time, the confirmation of family relations no longer existed only on paper or in the laboratory, but gradually became felt on a more personal level, through small details like similarities in gestures, emotional reactions, or inexplicable habits. Factors not enough to compensate for the separation, but sufficient to reinforce the awareness that this connection was not merely an abstract concept. However, alongside the connection came unavoidable long-term psychological effects, because reuniting after decades was not simply about finding each other, but about restructuring how each person understood themselves and their place in the world. For the biological family, William's return did not erase the pain of years spent searching in vain, but placed it in a new frame of meaning, where joy at recovering their child coexisted with regret over not being able to share the lost years fully. For William, being confirmed as a member of another family did not erase the relationships formed under his old identity, but created a fragmentation of identity, where he had to learn to reconcile multiple layers of self existing in parallel. These effects did not manifest immediately as clear crises, but seeped gradually into daily life, influencing how William and his biological family interacted, set expectations, and processed emotions, requiring a long time to adapt. The reunion also revealed a hard-to-accept reality. There was no way to return to the moment before the disappearance, and all efforts to rebuild the relationship had to be based on the present and future, not the past. The absence of a complete resolution became clear when the parties realized that even though the identity had been confirmed, and the basic truth clarified, unanswered questions, unfillable gaps, and unhealable wounds remained. There was no moment when all emotions were fully released, no ritual or declaration that could mark a clear end to the decades-long journey, because what was lost was not just time, but shared experiences that could never be recreated. The reunion, therefore, was not an emotional climax in the traditional sense, but a complex transitional phase where joy, pain, relief, and loss coexisted without excluding one another. In that state, the family and William had to accept that their story had no neat ending, that finding each other did not mean closing the past, and that their presence in each other's present was real, but could not erase what had happened. This acceptance, though difficult, became the only foundation for the new relationship to exist, not based on expectations of perfection, but on the understanding that reunion after years of separation always carries insurmountable limits. In that context, the lack of a complete ending was not seen as a failure of the journey, but as an honest reflection of reality, where truth and connection were found, but wholeness had been permanently taken by time, leaving a relationship that needed to be built carefully step by step, in the awareness that each present moment held its own value, even if it could not replace the lost years. After the reunion process unfolded cautiously, and without providing a sense of complete closure, the focus of the case file once again turned to the question that had hung unresolved for decades: who was responsible for William's disappearance, and whether there was any possibility of tracing that act within the current legal framework. Reviewing old suspects was conducted as a mandatory procedural step, not with high expectations of prosecution, but to ensure that all previously existing data in the file was re-examined in light of the new conclusion about the kidnapping. Names that had appeared in earlier investigation phases, even briefly, were brought back to the evaluation list, not to seek new evidence from exhausted leads, but to cross-reference with the reconstructed timeline and behavior pattern determined after Williams' identity was clarified. This process revealed that many old suspects had been eliminated not because they were proven innocent, but because they did not fit the initial investigative hypothesis, and when that hypothesis was disproven, their position in the file became ambiguous, not enough data to confirm, nor to fully exclude. However, the review quickly confronted an unavoidable reality. The legal status of potential suspects had changed significantly over time, with many no longer alive, others lacking sufficient information to determine residence or activity during the critical period, severely limiting any direct tracing efforts. Even in cases where old suspects' identities and personal histories could be verified, assessing legal status showed that current prosecution standards did not allow further progress, due to lack of physical evidence, direct testimony, and the ability to recreate the scene in a way that met court requirements. These limitations were not just a matter of elapsed time, but reflected the difference between establishing historical truth and proving crime under legal standards, two goals that do not always align. In an effort to broaden the context, investigators compared Williams' case to similar child disappearances from the same period, looking for common points in method, geography, and social circumstances, not to identify a specific suspect, but to determine if this kidnapping fit a pattern seen elsewhere. The comparison revealed some notable similarities, such as the short time frame of disappearance, absence of physical traces, and long-term maintenance of a new identity, but these were not specific enough to directly link cases in a legally sustainable way. Instead, they provided a broader picture of systemic vulnerabilities in child protection and identity tracking during that era, showing that Williams' case was not entirely isolated, though it could not be firmly tied to an organized series. When tracing possibilities were weighed together, prosecution limits became clearer than ever, not due to lack of goodwill, but because the legal system requires standards the case, at this point, could not meet. Investigators had to acknowledge that confirming the kidnapping and restoring the victim's identity did not equate to bringing the perpetrator to justice, and that efforts exceeding those limits risked harming the integrity of the justice system. In internal reports, the conclusion was noted cautiously, emphasizing that inability to prosecute was not a denial of responsibility, but recognition of objective limits of evidence and time. Reviewing old suspects, assessing legal status, and comparing similar cases, though not leading to specific criminal action, still held value in completing the file, allowing the system to affirm that all reasonable paths had been considered, and no realistic possibility was intentionally overlooked. For the family and William, this conclusion did not bring emotional satisfaction, as it provided no face or final explanation, but it drew a clear boundary between what could be known and what could be done, helping them understand that the absence of a conviction was not due to indifference, but a consequence of a journey too prolonged for the system to respond ideally. In that state, tracing the perpetrator was no longer an active hunt, but a procedural closure process, where possibilities were evaluated, limits recorded, and the file updated to reflect the reality that criminal justice, in this case, could not be achieved traditionally. This acknowledgement, though hard to accept, played a key role in shaping long-term perception of the case, not as total failure, but as evidence of the difference between uncovering truth and achieving punishment, emphasizing that sometimes the only thing the system can do is fully record what happened, restore the victim's identity, and leave the perpetrator question as an inseparable part of the story, rather than forcing an ending evidence does not allow. When all possibilities for tracing the perpetrator had been evaluated within legal and procedural limits, what remained in the file was not specific leads to an individual, but a set of fundamental questions never definitively answered, starting with the true motive behind William's kidnapping. There was no direct evidence of financial purpose, as no ransom demand or clear profiteering existed, nor indication of random impulse, since the level of control and long-term maintenance of a new identity suggested some preparation. This led to the assumption that the motive might be personal, or involve more complex psychological factors, where taking a child was not for immediate gain, but to fulfill a long-term need. Whatever that need was remained beyond investigative verification. The next question directly concerned why William was chosen. As in the social and residential context of his disappearance, nothing made him stand out more than other children in circumstances or accessibility. Victim selection might have been pure opportunity, but it did not rule out that William met some criterion the investigation could not reconstruct due to missing critical minutes and hours. The absence of specific data made determining the reason for selection a logical gap, where hypotheses remained speculative based on general patterns, not confirmable by evidence. One of the most complex questions involved the method of substitution and identity maintenance. As a child growing up under a different name, with delayed paperwork and no original records, revealed systemic loopholes large enough to be exploited undetected for years. The investigation could determine that the new identity was not built in one moment, but formed gradually through scattered administrative procedures, but could not identify who actively carried it out, who provided initial information, or how oversights went unquestioned seriously. The lack of original records was not just administrative, but key to the entire identity swap, raising whether this was intentional exploitation of system weaknesses, or merely the result of unchecked minor decisions. On a broader view, investigators could not avoid considering possible other victims, not based on direct evidence of specific cases, but on logic, that an effective undetected method over years might have been used more than once. Case characteristics from quick disappearance, no traces, to long-term victim integration into a new life, created a clear enough pattern to make this question unavoidable, though no specific data existed to launch new investigations. However, within the current file, possible other victims were noted only as analytical observation, lacking basis to determine scope or scale, and this ambiguity underscored limits of knowledge after decades. Unanswered questions reflected not just missing information, but how time and circumstances distorted truth-seeking ability. With witnesses gone, physical evidence vanished, and social context changed beyond accurate recreation. For the investigative system, recording these questions aimed not to create incompleteness, but to honestly acknowledge that not every case can be fully explained, and defining boundaries between known truth and unknowable is part of professional responsibility. For the family and William, these questions existed as an inseparable layer of the story, where identity restoration and reunion did not fully eliminate the need to understand why it happened that way. Lack of definitive answers for motive, victim selection reason, or identity swap method made case closure relative, not an endpoint but a prolonged pause, where basic truth was confirmed, but key details remained out of reach. In this pause, the William Rodriguez case stands as evidence of inherent limits in investigating long-past events, where each unanswered question is not just data or technology failure, but consequence of people and systems operating imperfectly. Unanswered questions, thus, are not something to eliminate for completeness, but essential to the full picture, reminding that truth-seeking sometimes reaches only a certain depth, and unknowable elements are the price for confronting multi-generational cases, where time both conceals and shapes how we understand and accept what occurred. When unanswered questions were fully recorded as an inseparable part of the file, the final administrative decision was made not to declare all mysteries solved, but to confirm the case had reached the maximum limit of what the system could do currently. and on that basis, the William Rodriguez file was officially marked solved in the modern procedural sense. This labeling did not imply closing all debate or denying remaining gaps, but reflected a fundamental shift in understanding case resolution, where identifying the victim, clarifying the act's nature, and restoring identity were core criteria, even without prosecuting the perpetrator. In the investigative system, this milestone held great symbolic value, showing a half-century cold case no longer existed as an unresolved question, but was transformed into a file with clear conclusions on foundational elements. Marking solved also triggered comprehensive updates to databases from missing persons, abducted children, to related federal systems, ensuring William was no longer listed as a missing child, but recorded as an identified living victim. This change was not just technical but expressive, ending William's suspended identity status in the system, where previously he was both a present individual and a name frozen in the past. For the investigative system, closing the case offered a rare chance to review handling a multi-generational cold case, from traditional method limits to modern technology potential. The William file became a typical study case, not to celebrate complete victory, but to analyze how initial assumptions, reasonable in their era, could lead to prolonged dead ends if unchallenged by new data. The greatest meaning for the system lay in illustrating that resolution need not mean arrest and conviction, but could be re-establishing truth, correcting historical records, and acknowledging criminal justice limits against time. In this picture, modern DNA emerged as decisive, not for directly identifying the perpetrator, but for providing objective verification strong enough to break decades-old assumptions. DNA technology connected seemingly unrelated data fragments, turning personal suspicion into grounded investigation, and importantly, allowed the system to view old files not as immutable past legacy, but updatable structures with suitable tools. In this case, DNA was not conclusive evidence ending debate, but a catalyst forcing agencies to reopen the file, cross-check data, and accept truth might lie beyond what was once certain. This role extended beyond one case, setting precedent for future cold case approaches, not just new leads, but reinterpreting old data with new technology. However, the deepest meaning of closing the case lay not in system or technology, but in the victim's identity finally restored officially and fully. For William, being recorded by true name in files did not erase years lived under another identity, but ended fragmented existence, where he carried two parallel stories, neither fully validated. Identity restoration meant recovery, not returning life to origin, but acknowledging origin truth, and giving William ownership of his story. For the biological family, solved marking did not bring absolute satisfaction, as no conviction or confession accompanied it, but affirmed their child's disappearance was not forgotten. The system finally recognized the case nature correctly, and recorded the truth they believed for years. Closing the cold case, in this context, was not emotional ending but transformation, placing pain and questions in new meaningful frame, no longer suspended unrecognized. The William Rodriguez file, when closed, carried all the case represented traditional investigation limits, modern technology power, and reality, that justice not always appears as punishment. It became evidence the system can self-correct, though late, by admitting errors, updating knowledge, and restoring victim identity, even if unable to meet ideal justice fully. Marking solved did not erase remaining questions, but placed them properly, not anonymous gaps, but acknowledged story parts. In that state, the cold case was no longer failure or deadlock symbol, but reminder that truth can be delayed but not necessarily buried forever. When the file closed, what remained was not victory feeling, but clarity. After 50 years, a vanished child was found, called by true name, and returned to history position, not as question mark, but real person with story, recognized as fully as possible. The William Rodriguez story offers a very pragmatic American-style lesson on safety, paperwork, and how modern society can both protect and inadvertently hide truth. In 1972, the Rodriguez family lived in the familiar sense of security, in a working-class Florida neighborhood, kids playing outside, adults trusting community safety, and one moment of hesitation before an unusual factor created an irreparable void. The first lesson is to treat small signals as data requiring response, not oversensitivity. A friendly stranger, unfamiliar situation, lost time, not matching routine, like in William's case. Those are signs needing immediate action. Call family, gather kids to one spot, alert neighbors, contact authorities early. The second lesson comes from William growing up under another identity. Sufficient paperwork does not mean correct. Delayed records, missing originals, conflicting birth dates, origins are specific warnings for today's American families. Store copies of birth certificates, medical records, school papers. Teach kids basic personal info and how to seek help. The third lesson is technology power with responsibility. DNA pulled the file from archives and restored William's true name, but reminds us personal data can change lives. If using DNA tests, prepare mentally for system surprises, respect family privacy, and if abnormality found, contact authorities instead of speculating alone. Finally, this story advises building kind vigilance culture. Trust people but not naively. Prioritize child safety, and view checking, record keeping, and early response as community responsibility part. If you find William Rodriguez's journey to reclaim identity and lessons from a half-century cold case thought-provoking, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other investigation stories where truth is sometimes found only after many years of silence. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video with another case where the past is still waiting to speak.